I'm an old man now, or old enough to count winters by the aches they leave behind. The orchard is quiet at first light, and the trees lift their pale blossoms like hands in prayer. When the wind moves through, it does it gentle, as if someone taught it manners. That's not how I remember it. There was a year when the wind had teeth. It bit the cabin walls. It bit my pride. It bit the breath right out of my boy. I see that winter every time these trees bloom. I smell wet lumber and lamp oil. I hear the floorboards creak under boots that were always damp. My son's cry lived in that room like an animal that would not be driven out. He was small, all jaw and fists, and he wanted something I did not have. His mother had died before I learned how to say the word widow without flinching. The milk that should have fed him lay buried with her on the hill. I kept telling myself, a man could make dew. A man could boil oats in water, stir sugar into cow's milk, rock a cradle until the hinge wore smooth. A man could outstare any storm. I was wrong. The day the storm found its full voice, the cry began at dusk and did not let go. I tried every trick an older ranch hand ever told me. I warmed a cloth by the stove and laid it on the boy's belly. I sang low, the kind of song a father sings to keep himself from breaking. I stepped outside for air and came back with snow in my beard and the truth in my lungs. The truth was this: I had no answer left. There's a moment a proud man learns the difference between stubborn and foolish. That moment came to me with the hiss of snow against the door. I planed a spare board smooth enough to take paint. I found the little tin Margaret kept for writing names on calves. I wrote with a cold brush that shook so much it made the letters look young. Need mother's milk. I did not put a question mark. I did not know how to ask. I nailed that sign to the fence post at the road. The hammer sounded small in the white roar. I stood there longer than I needed to, as if the sign might answer me back. No rider came down the lane. No wagon lantern showed. The wind did not care about a man's need or his shame, and I suppose that was fair. Shame is a thing a man uses on himself. Inside, the boy's cry climbed higher, then broke, then started again. I carried him in circles until our shadows made a clock on the wall. I told him I knew he was hungry and that I was working on it. I told him things a grown man should not have to say to a child, promises I could not keep. My voice wore out. He did not. Toward midnight, the storm changed. Snow shifted to needles of ice that rattled on the panes. I set the boy down in the cradle and tucked the quilt around him. I opened the door to check the drift against the step. That is when I saw her. She was a shape at first, something dark inside the white. The wind tried to pull her away, and she leaned into it like a mule on a stubborn load. She wore a gray cloak, hood up, hem caked with ice. Her hands were bare. I remember that because one hand held the cloak tight at her throat, and the other pressed against her belly, as if she were holding herself together. She had no lantern. She had no business on a road at such an hour unless business had driven her and would not be denied. I did not speak. I lifted my arm and waved slow, like a man guiding a skittish mare into the corral. She lowered her head and came on. At the step, she had to put her hand on the door frame and catch a breath. The hood fell back. Her hair was the color of winter wheat under ash. Snow had daubed it until it looked like frost on a fence wire. Her face was not what you would call pretty, not in the way folks crowd around to see. It was thin and it was honest, and there was a kind of quiet to it that made me think of far horizons. I said her name without meaning to. Nora. She nodded once, not surprised I knew her. We were neighbors the way folks are neighbors out here. You can count the roofs from your ridgeline, and you learn the names by the speed a person rides and the way their dogs speak. She did not ask about the storm or the time. She said one thing. I heard him. I could not hold her gaze. I stepped back and let her pass. She smelled of cold wool and something clean underneath, like lye soap and rain. The boy's cry jumped at the draft and shot toward her, as if it knew. She crossed that room as if the floor had been measured to her stride. I stood useless while she unpinned her cloak and set it over the chair by the stove. Her hands moved with a purpose that did not show itself as hurry. She pulled a shawl across her shoulders and sat, not in any chair, but in that rocking chair, the one Margaret had used. It should have cut me. It should have opened some angry door inside me. It did not. The sight of another woman shaped there did something else I'm not proud of. It let me breathe. I handed her my son. She did not take him all at once. She laid her palm on his chest and waited until his cry found a pause. Then she lifted him and tucked him, quiet as a prayer being said for a friend. The room changed, not quick, not like a lantern lit, more like when the first twig catches and smoke becomes flame without boasting. If you have never watched a hungry child fall into silence, you may not understand why a grown man would turn his face to the wall and thank God at a run. I did not say the words out loud. I did not need to. The rock of that chair said them for me. Wood whispered to wood. A small sound came from her throat. Not a tune, not words, just a thread of comfort that hung in the air and held. We stayed like that a long while. The stove popped. The storm scratched its nails and went looking for another house to test. My breath settled into the same slow measure as the chair. I could not stop staring at her hands. They were chapped along the knuckles, pink where the cold had bitten them, strong across the palm. A scar like a white feather lay near her wrist. When she shifted the baby, my heart kicked the way a colt does at the rope for the first time. It was not romance. It was recognition. Life recognizes life when it has been walking beside death for too long. When the boy had his fill, he loosened his mouth and gave a sigh a man would give after a good meal and a better story. She drew him to her shoulder and patted until his little body softened and went heavy. Then she looked up at me, and that was the first time I felt the full weight of what was happening. We were two people in a room made for four, and the missing took their seats with us. "Thank you," I said. My voice sounded rough and farther away than it should have. She nodded. "You put a sign out," she said. "I saw it at dusk when I fetched water. I did not know what to do with the knowing. Then I heard him." She glanced down at the boy. My milk came in. The words were plain and without apology. The truth of them landed like a warm cup set in my hands. The storm had not given up, but it had lost interest in scaring us. I put more wood on the fire and tried to think of something to offer. Bread, tea, company. None of it fit right. She adjusted her shawl and asked if she might stay until morning. The road would drift shut by the hour. I told her she could stay as long as she needed. I meant that and more. I meant months if that was the cost of keeping my son alive. I meant forever, without knowing it yet. The chair moved. The flame hummed. Somewhere outside, a fence rail cracked and then decided to hold. I leaned my head against the door and looked at the sign through the window. The words were icing over. It struck me that prayer sometimes looks like begging and sometimes looks like paint on a board. That night, it looked like a woman with quiet eyes and a child who had finally found silence. Morning came slow, as if the world had forgotten how to make light. I woke before the stove burned low, before the baby stirred. For a few heartbeats, I thought it had all been a dream. The storm was only a whisper now, the kind that licks around the shutters like a tired hound. I turned and saw her still in the chair, her head tilted back, the boy curled in her lap. The fire had painted their faces in soft copper. For the first time in weeks, there was no sound of hunger in that room. I moved quiet, afraid that any sudden breath might break the spell. When I laid a hand on the table, it groaned. She opened her eyes right then. There was no startle in her, only the slow return of someone who had been too long without rest. I nodded toward the stove. She nodded back. That was the whole of our talk for a while. I made coffee that tasted of smoke and iron. She drank half a cup, eyes still on the child, and said nothing until the first shaft of sun found the floor. "It's easing," I said, meaning the storm. "Meaning something else," she answered. He'll sleep a while now. You should too." But I couldn't. My body was stiff with the memory of nights that never ended. I paced the cabin, touching things that suddenly seemed like strangers. Margaret's sewing basket, the cradle, the small mirror cracked in one corner. When I looked in it, the face staring back could have been any worn man with a bad beard and a worse conscience. I told her, "I'm not used to company." "I'm not company," she said, "just help." The way she said it left no space for argument. She rose, careful not to wake the boy, and found her cloak. When she stepped outside, snow rose past her boots. The sky was blue and cruel, that kind of brightness that comes only after a storm has emptied itself. She looked across the field to her own land, a gray line of fence and smoke far off. "I'll come again before dusk," she said. "You don't have to." "I know." She smiled once, barely, and was gone into the glare. I stood at the door until she was only a blur, moving steady across the drift. My boy slept. The silence inside was heavy, but it was the kind that promised peace, not despair. I went to the fence and pulled the sign down. The paint had frozen. The letters blurred into ghost shapes. I tossed it into the snow and watched it sink. That day was long and clean. I fed the stock, shoveled the path, kept the fire breathing. The wind no longer sounded angry, just restless. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low and turned the world to brass. I heard her boots before I saw her. She came with a small bundle of cloth and a loaf wrapped in paper. "It's barley bread," she said, "and there's milk enough for another feeding." I let her in. The boy woke when she crossed the threshold, as if her shadow carried his name. She sat again in that chair, natural as if she had never left. Watching her, I felt something tighten and then loosen in my chest. There was rhythm now. Her hand, the chair, the baby's breath. Life was finding its measure again. We talked some, not much. She told me her husband had been gone 2 years, taken by a fire that started in their barn. She spoke without tremble, just a slow turning of words that sounded worn from use. I told her about Margaret how she'd taken fever in the birthing and never woke. I said her name like a man testing an old wound. Nora only nodded. "We all keep our ghosts," she said. "Some of them learn to sit quiet." Evening settled around us. I offered her the bed. She refused. Said the chair would do. She had a way of making small refusals sound like kindnesses. I laid a quilt at her feet and doused the lamp. In the dark, the cabin breathed with us. The boy's sighs were soft as falling ash. I closed my eyes and let sleep find me for the first time in months. When I woke again, dawn had not yet come. Nora was standing at the window, the child on her shoulder. She was humming, low and broken, a sound like wind through grass. I asked if something was wrong. "Only dreaming," she said. "Sometimes I wake before I remember where I am." Does the dreaming hurt? She thought on that. Not always. Sometimes it reminds me I can still feel. She turned, and in the dim light her face looked carved from patience itself. There were shadows under her eyes, and the scar at her wrist caught a trace of firelight. I wanted to reach out, not to touch her, but to prove she was real. Instead, I went to the stove, threw in a stick of wood, and asked if she'd stay for breakfast. She stayed. She made eggs from the hens I'd near forgotten, swept the floor, set the kettle just so. It had been a long time since I'd seen a home act like one. When she left later, she said, "You'll need more milk by nightfall." "I'll have it ready," I answered, though we both knew I had nothing to do with the having. For 3 days, she came and went, bringing small things, cloths, herbs, a jar of honey. Each visit felt less like charity and more like breath. The talk between us grew, not wider, but deeper. She spoke of her farm and the silence there. I spoke of the river bend where Margaret and I used to fish. She never asked about love. I never spoke the word. On the 4th day, she didn't come. I waited until dusk, then longer. The boy fussed and turned his head, searching. Snow began again, light as sifted flour. I set another log on the fire and told myself she'd come when she could. But night deepened, and the quiet grew heavy enough to bend the rafters. I walked to the window and stared into the dark, listening for boots that did not come. When the knock finally came, it was soft, almost shy. I opened the door and found her pale, breath short, one hand gripping the frame. "It's nothing," she said, though her voice trembled. "Just caught a chill." I moved aside and she stepped in, but her legs buckled before she reached the chair. I caught her under the arms, felt the heat rolling off her skin. "You're burning," I said. "Don't fuss," she managed. "It'll pass." It did not. Within the hour, the fever took hold, hard and fast. I laid her on the bed she'd refused and wiped her face with water cold enough to sting my fingers. The boy whimpered from his cradle, sensing the wrong in the air. She tried to sit, whispering about milk, but I pressed her down. "Hush now," I said. "He'll manage. You rest." Her eyes found mine through the haze. "You don't know how to hush a woman, Jonas Hale." I almost smiled. "Reckon I'm learning." Outside, the wind began again, gentle this time. The world was shrinking to the sound of her breath and the boy's small heartbeat. I sat through that night, counting both. Near dawn, her fever broke like a dam giving way. She slept then, deep and untroubled, and I knew I'd been given something worth keeping. When she woke, the first thing she asked was about the baby. I set him in her arms, and she looked down at him with a softness that could mend a man. "You stayed," she said. "I did." "Then we're even." I wanted to tell her nothing in this world made us even, but the words would not come. Instead, I stoked the fire, poured coffee, and listened to the storm die one more time. It had learned, like me, to go quiet when Grace walked into the room. Spring came late that year, dragging its feet through mud and leftover snow. The ground refused to thaw, and the air smelled of wet iron. Nora stayed on, though we never spoke of it as staying. She came each day, fed the boy, helped with the chores that waited like tired animals at the edge of my mind. She cooked sometimes, always enough for two, and pretended not to notice when I ate like a man starving for more than food. It took weeks before the valley looked like life again. The drifts pulled back from the fences, showing wire and bone. Calves stumbled on shaky legs, their breath rising in ribbons. The boy grew quiet, then curious, his eyes opening wider every time she leaned over him. He'd reach for her hair, the pale strands slipping through his fingers like sunlight. She laughed soft, not to make noise, but to let him feel the sound. I caught myself smiling at that, then turned away, so neither would see. We settled into a kind of rhythm. She'd come at dawn, stayed through noon, sometimes longer. I'd fix whatever was broken. Fence rails, harness straps, a stovepipe that never stayed straight. She'd hum while she worked, tunes without names, little bits of comfort that stitched the day together. Nights she'd walk home, a small figure crossing the pale hills. I'd watch from the porch until she vanished, then carry the boy to his cradle and tell him about things that didn't matter, just to hear a voice in the room. One morning she arrived with a basket of seedlings, tiny apple sprouts wrapped in burlap. "You ought to plant something," she said, "something that outlives a season." "I plant what feeds me," I told her. She set one sprout on the table. "These will feed you too if you wait long enough." I didn't argue. That afternoon, we dug 4 holes behind the cabin. The ground fought us, stiff with frost, but she worked until her hands went red. She named each tree under her breath: Margaret, Thomas, Nora, Jonas. I pretended not to hear, though the names fell like blessings. When we finished, she stood back and looked at them, 4 thin sticks leaning into the wind. "You'll see," she said. "By summer they'll remember what warmth is." Days blurred into weeks. Folks in town began to talk. You could feel it in the way they looked away too quick or smiled with their lips and not their eyes. Out here people measure morality by the length of a porch light, and who shares it after dark. They knew she came. They didn't know why. That was enough. I went into town one morning for feed, and the storekeeper's wife handed me my change without touching my hand. "Fine weather," I said. She nodded like she hadn't heard. On the way out, I caught 2 men watching me from the hitch rail, their talk dying as I passed. You learn to live with silence different ways. Sometimes you fight it. Sometimes you let it stand. That day, I let it stand. When I came home, Nora was hanging laundry. The baby lay in a basket beside her, kicking at the air. She looked up, saw my face, and knew. "They'll tire of it," she said. "They won't," I answered. "Out here folks keep gossip the way they keep cattle, tight-fenced and well-fed." She smiled, but there was a tremor in it. "Then we'll outlast them." That night, the wind came back, not fierce, just enough to make the walls whisper. I sat by the fire, the boy sleeping in my arm, Nora sewing near the stove. The light caught her face, the faint scar at her wrist, the calm there. She looked at peace, like she belonged. I didn't say it out loud. Some truths are better left quiet so they can grow. After a while, she said, You should sleep. I will when you do. She shook her head, still stitching. You're afraid I'll vanish. I've seen enough leaving to know it doesn't always give warning. The thread snapped. She tied it off slow. I'm not her, Jonas. I know that. Then stop waiting for me to disappear, Purim. The words landed heavy, like a gate closing. I didn't answer. She gathered her things and stood. Good night, she said. I watched her walk to the door, the lamplight tracing her shoulders. When she was gone, the cabin felt smaller, filled with echoes I couldn't name. The next morning, she returned as always. No mention of what had passed. The day stretched wide and quiet. We worked side by side, fixing a trough, cutting kindling. The air warmed enough that you could smell pine again. By noon, she was humming that same nameless tune, and I knew the world hadn't ended after all. Around midsummer, a letter arrived. One of those folded papers passed from hand to hand along the stage road. It was addressed to Jonas Hale, South Fork. Inside was a note from the town clerk, written neat and official. A reminder about land dues and concerns raised by members of the congregation. The words were polite, but they stank of warning. I folded it once and set it under a plate. When Nora came that evening, I handed it to her. She read it slow, lips pressed thin. They want a reason, she said. They want blood. Maybe they just want proof that a man and woman can share kindness without sin. Maybe they've forgotten what kindness looks like. She laid the letter down. You could marry again. The words hung there. I looked at her, at the way she held herself, steady but braced. You offering? Her eyes met mine. I'm saying it would stop their talk. I'd rather they talk than turn you into charity. That's not what I asked. The boy fussed then, saving us both from an answer. She took him, quieted him, and didn't speak again. The fire burned down low, and outside, the young apple trees rattled in the wind like bones learning a song. For a week after, the valley held its breath. No letters came, no visits, just work and weather and the uneasy truce between us. Then one Sunday morning, 3 riders appeared at the gate. Reverend Hall, Councilman Reese, and old Mrs. Patterson wrapped in more fur than a grizzly. They dismounted slow, faces carved from judgment. I stepped out to meet them. The Reverend cleared his throat. Jonas, we've had word there's a woman living here, not your wife. She's not living here, I said. She's helping me keep my child alive. Mrs. Patterson sniffed. Decency don't make exceptions for charity. I could feel the boy crying inside, Nora's soft voice trying to hush him. The Reverend shifted, uneasy. The council gives you 4 days. You marry proper, or we'll review your claim to this property. Can't have scandal breeding in the valley. I stared at them, the 3 of them shivering under all that righteousness. You take a roof from a child for the sake of your reputation? Reese looked away. We'll expect your decision. They mounted, turned, and rode off, leaving tracks like scars across the snowmelt. When I went inside, Nora was standing by the window, the boy in her arms. They came, she said. They came. What will you do? I didn't know then. I only knew the look in her eyes, tired, proud, ready to run if she had to. We'll talk in the morning, I said. She nodded once, as if she'd already decided something I hadn't. The fire snapped. The boy yawned. Outside, the apple trees bent under the wind, and I thought about how much a man could lose before pride was just another word for fear. Morning broke sharp and bright, the kind of day that makes a man see too clearly. The valley glittered under a thin crust of frost, the air clean as cut glass. I'd slept none. The baby had, though, thanks to her. She was already dressed when I came out from the back room, her cloak folded over one arm, her hair braided tight. "You're leaving," I said, though it sounded more like an accusation than a question. "I have to," she answered. "They gave you 4 days, Jonas. If I stay, they'll take what's yours." "What's mine?" I said. "Seems to me you've had more claim to this place than any of them." She looked at me, calm but sad. "They won't see it that way. And I won't have your land or your boy pay for what people choose to think." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her the land didn't matter, not compared to what she'd given me, but the words knotted in my throat. I just nodded and said, "You'll freeze before you reach your gate." "I'll manage." She glanced toward the cradle. The boy slept, one fist clutching the edge of the blanket. "He'll be fine now." "Fine?" I almost laughed. "You think I can feed him stories?" She reached into her satchel and drew out 2 small bottles, stoppered tight. "There's milk enough for a few days. After that," her voice broke on the edge of silence. "After that what?" I asked, though I already knew. She didn't answer. She set the bottles on the table, put on her cloak, and pulled the hood over her head. "Goodbye, Jonas." That word hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't lift. She opened the door, and cold air rolled through the cabin. I followed her onto the porch. The light was too bright, the snow too white. I wanted to reach for her arm, to find some way to hold her there. But pride is a heavy thing. It anchors your hands when they should move. "You think walking away fixes this?" I said. "No," she answered, turning back once. "But maybe it keeps the rest of your world from breaking." Then she walked down the path, her steps sinking deep. I stood there until she disappeared over the ridge. Inside, the boy woke and started crying. His voice was thin, confused, a sound that went right through the ribs. I picked him up, tried to rock him, whispering nonsense. "She'll be back, little man," I said. "She just needs time." But the words didn't hold weight. The house felt wrong. Too wide, too quiet. That day dragged on slow. The snow melted in streaks, and the trees shook off what was left of winter. I fed the stock, patched a leak in the roof, did everything that needed doing, but every corner of that place had her shadow in it. The chair by the stove, the shawl she'd forgotten folded over the back of a chair, the faint scent of soap in the air. By the 3rd day, I'd almost convinced myself she wouldn't return. I caught myself talking to the boy like he could answer. "We'll be all right," I said. "We'll find a way." He smiled once, the way babies do when they're dreaming, and I took that as a kind of blessing. Then the wind picked up. It came from the north, the color of iron, and the sky bruised over with clouds. Before long, snow started again, thin flakes at first, then heavy. I felt the storm's weight before I heard it. I stepped outside, looked toward her land, and saw nothing but white. I saddled the mare. The Reverend's letter still sat on the table, but I left it there. Some things are better faced standing up, not signing papers. I wrapped the boy in a blanket, set him in a basket near the stove, and told him I'd be back before he missed me. Then I rode. The snow came harder with each mile. The trail to her place cut along the creek, now a black ribbon under ice. The wind drove sideways, filling my collar with knives. By the time I reached her gate, the world had shrunk to the horse's breath and the creak of leather. Her house was dark. The barn door swung on one hinge. I dismounted, stumbled to the porch, and called her name. No answer. I pushed the door open. Inside was cold, colder than outside. The hearth was dead. She lay on the floor near the bed, half covered by a quilt. For a second, I thought she was gone. Then she moved, just barely, a tremor along her arm. Jonas. Her voice was small, thin as smoke. "I've got you," I said, kneeling beside her. Her skin burned under my hand. Fever again, maybe worse this time. I lifted her, felt how light she'd become. "Why didn't you call for help?" "I tried," she whispered. Wine took my voice. I wrapped her in the quilt, carried her outside, and set her across the saddle. She didn't protest. Her head rested against my shoulder like it belonged there. I led the mare through the storm, each step a prayer. By the time we reached the cabin, night had fallen, and the door was half buried in snow. Inside, the fire had nearly gone out. I laid her on the bed, threw wood in the stove until the room glowed. She shivered once, then went still. I mixed what medicine I could, honey, hot water, whiskey, and pressed the cup to her lips. "Drink," I said. She did. Barely. All that night, I sat beside her, wiping her brow, counting each breath. The boy slept near the fire, his small hand twitching in dreams. The wind clawed at the shutters, but the house held. Every so often, she'd stir and mumble something I couldn't catch. Once she said, "Don't let them take him." I didn't know if she meant the child or me. Maybe both. Near dawn, the fever broke. Her breathing eased. Her skin cooled. I let my head fall to the edge of the mattress, too tired to pray, too grateful not to. When the first light touched the window, she opened her eyes. "You shouldn't have come," she said, voice rough but alive. "I shouldn't have let you go," I answered. "You'll lose the land." "I'd lose more than that if I'd stayed put." She looked at me then, really looked, and something shifted between us. The distance that had been there, built from grief and fear and other people's words, fell away, like snow from a roof. I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. We stayed that way until the baby stirred. She smiled faintly, that soft corner smile she had. "He'll need feeding," she said. "Then stay and feed him," I told her. Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with a kind of tired relief. "You're a stubborn man, Jonas Hale." "Stubborn enough," I said, "to tell a preacher no." That morning we fed the fire, and she fed the boy. The wind died outside. The world, for a few blessed hours, was quiet. Later, she sat in the chair again, the one by the stove, rocking slow. The boy slept on her shoulder. I stood behind her, watching the flame lick the stove's mouth. "What do we do now?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. "We do what folks always do out here," she said finally. "We survive first. The rest will name itself." And so we did. For the next few days, no one came. The snow melted off the roof. The creek began to murmur again. She was stronger. The boy laughed for the first time. A real laugh, bright and sudden like a bell in the stillness. She looked at me then, eyes shining. "He's learning your stubbornness," she said. "Maybe so, but I was learning hers." We didn't speak of the council again for several days. The world outside our walls seemed to have gone quiet, But quiet in the west is only the space before another storm. Nora was stronger now. She helped in the yard, milking the cow, feeding the hens. The boy watched her from the cradle, his eyes following her as if he'd known her all his small life. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at him like he was borrowed light, something she'd never thought to see again. One afternoon, we sat on the porch, the first real warmth of spring soaking through the boards. She was shelling peas, hands steady and sure, and I was mending tack. The boy slept between us in a basket, his fist curled tight around nothing. She said, "Do you ever think about leaving here, going somewhere new?" I shook my head. This land's got more ghosts than most. I couldn't take them with me. Maybe they'd like the change. I smiled at that. "You ever think of leaving?" "Every day," she said. Then after a pause, "And then every day, I stay." The way she said it left no room for questions. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of thawing earth and horses. For a moment I thought about what it would mean to have her stay for good, not out of duty, not because of talk, but because she wanted to. Then I heard hoofbeats, 3 riders again, same as before. Reverend Hall, Reese, and Mrs. Patterson wrapped tight in moral purpose. I stood as they approached. Nora gathered the boy, stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The Reverend dismounted first. "Jonas," he said, "the council's deadline is tomorrow." "I know." He looked tired, maybe sorry. "No one wants this trouble, but rules are rules. Rules are made by men who don't have to live with what they decide." Mrs. Patterson sniffed. "Don't speak against the Lord's order." "The Lord didn't write your bylaws, ma'am." Reese cleared his throat. "We're here to remind you. Marry or vacate. That's final." I felt the old anger rise, hot and steady. "You're trespassing," I said. The Reverend's face softened. "Jonas, please. You're a good man. She's a good woman. You could do worse than make it proper." I looked past him at the mountains, at the clouds gathering like bruises on the horizon. "You think a ring makes us pure?" "It makes you safe," he said. They left after that, their horses kicking up little whirlwinds of dust. I watched them go until they were specks on the ridge. When I turned, Nora stood at the door. "What will you do, Shoshana?" she asked. "I'll do what I should have done the day you knocked." She frowned. "Jonas." "I'm asking you to stay," I said. "Not for them, for us." Her eyes searched mine, cautious. "And what are we exactly?" "2 people who've already shared the hardest parts of living," I said. "Seems foolish to stop now." She looked down at the baby, then back at me. "You're talking about a bargain." "I'm talking about a promise," I said, "and maybe a little peace." For a long while she didn't answer. Then she nodded once. "If we do this, it's for survival, not salvation." "That's enough," I said. "We'll let salvation catch up later." The next day, I hitched the wagon and rode us into town. The streets were muddy from the last melt, and folks stood outside the store to watch us pass. I held my head high, though inside I felt like a man walking into judgment. The Reverend met us at the chapel door. "Have you come to set things right?" he asked. "Reckon so," I said. He led us inside. The chapel smelled of dust and old pine. Light streamed through narrow windows, painting us in gold and shadow. Nora stood straight, her hands clasped around the small bundle she carried, the boy sleeping inside. I took off my hat, looked at her, and felt the strange calm of a decision too big to undo. The ceremony was short. Words about duty and union, about God's eye and man's word. I repeated them all, though my throat was dry. When it came time to exchange vows, I looked at her and said, "I will." She said it too, steady as stone. When the Reverend pronounced us man and wife, the room felt both smaller and wider at once. Mrs. Patterson wasn't there, but I could almost hear her satisfaction floating in from the street. Nora turned to me. Her face was pale, but there was a spark there, defiance, maybe even relief. I wanted to touch her hand, but I waited until we stepped outside. The sun was high now, bright enough to make us squint. She said, "It's done." "It is. What now?" "We go home," I said. Back at the cabin, the wind had shifted south, carrying the smell of grass and promise. The apple trees trembled with new buds. She went inside first, laid the boy in his cradle, and stood looking at him a long while. Then she turned to me. "You don't have to pretend, Jonas." "Pretend what?" "That this means something more than a name on paper." I met her gaze. A name on paper never saved anyone, but it might buy us time. I'll take that. She smiled, tired but soft. "You're a practical man." "Not always." That night, we ate in silence. The air felt different, thick with something unnamed. She moved around the room with quiet ease, setting the lamp, checking the fire, all the motions that make a house feel whole. When she passed behind me, her sleeve brushed my shoulder. The touch was nothing and everything. Later, I found her sitting on the porch, looking at the stars. "Cold night," I said. She nodded. "Feels like the world's holding its breath." We sat there a long time, listening to the wind through the trees. Somewhere down in the valley, a coyote cried, thin and lonely. She said, "Well, maybe they'll stop talking now." "They won't," I said, "but let 'em talk." She glanced at me, a faint smile in her eyes. "You're not the man I met that night." "No," I said. "He didn't know what he needed. And now I do." She didn't ask what that was. She just leaned back, watching the sky. The moon climbed higher, pale and patient, and the light touched her face in a way that made the world feel bearable again. For the first time since Margaret died, the wind didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like a promise kept. The weeks after the wedding passed slow, the way time moves when it's learning a new shape. Folks in town stopped sending letters, but not their glances. Every trip for feed or mail came with whispers under breath and looks that cut like dry grass. Nora didn't complain, not once. She carried herself with a quiet steadiness that made their judgment shrink to nothing. I watched her move through it all like weather, never hurried, never bowed. Inside our walls, life settled into a rhythm. Mornings, she'd feed the boy while I tended the stock. The smell of coffee and firewood would fill the cabin before the sun cleared the ridge. We didn't speak much, not the kind of talk meant to fill silence. We spoke the way working people do. Small words about chores, about whether the creek was rising, about how the apple trees were taken to their new ground. But under those words was something else, something like peace. At night, she'd sit in the rocking chair, sewing or just holding the child. I'd sit across from her, mending harness, cleaning the rifle, pretending to be busy. Sometimes the chair's rhythm would find its way into my breathing. Once she caught me watching her and said, "You make a habit of staring." Jonas Hale. Only when I see something worth remembering, I told her. She looked down, the corner of her mouth turning up. Careful, she said, you'll start sounding like a man with feelings. I had some once, I said. Thought the wind took 'em. It didn't, she said. You just buried them where it was quiet. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound smaller than the truth. By midsummer, the apple trees had leafed out, thin green shimmer against the sky. She'd visit them every morning, touching each trunk like a prayer. They'll need pruning soon, she said, if we want fruit by next year. We'll prune, I said. We'll keep 'em strong. She looked at me then, sunlight catching in her hair. You talk like you plan to stay. I do. That night, the wind carried the first thunder of the season. Rain came in long sheets, drumming the roof, soaking the earth until it smelled alive again. We sat by the fire, the boy asleep between us. Do you ever miss it? She asked. What's that? Before all this, before loss turned everything quiet. Some days, I said, no, mostly I miss not knowing how bad it could get. She nodded. Ignorance makes vine shelter till the roof caves in. You build again. Her eyes found mine. And what if the ground's still shaking? Then you build anyway. She smiled faintly, and that was the end of it. But the word stayed with me long after the rain stopped. Summer burned through the valley. Grass went tall and gold, and the nights carried the hum of insects. We worked side by side, tending the small things that make a life. The boy learned to laugh, loud and sudden. Sometimes he'd crawl to where I sat, tugging at my boot, demanding to be lifted. When I held him high, he'd squeal and slap the brim of my hat, and Nora would laugh, that quiet, low sound that made the cabin feel wider. But peace never lasts long in a place built on hardship. By August, sickness spread through the valley. Measles, some said, brought by travelers on the stage road. Word reached us late. By then, half the town was coughing. Children dying in 2s and 3s. We stayed put, kept to our land. Still, the fear crept in like fog. One night, I found Nora at the boy's cradle, her hand on his forehead. He's warm, she said. It's the fire, I told her, though I felt the same worry twist in me. We sat up through the night, trading cool cloths, counting breaths. By morning, his fever broke, leaving him weak but smiling. We both cried then, quiet tears, the kind that come from relief heavier than grief. Afterward, she wouldn't let him out of her sight for days. I didn't stop her. She'd earned the right to guard what life had left her. One evening, as the sun bled over the hills, I found her outside with the baby on her hip. The apple trees shimmered behind her, their leaves whispering like they knew secrets. He'll walk soon, she said. He'll run, I told her, and fall. Then we'll pick him up, she smiled. You sound sure. I've had practice, I said, and she laughed, really laughed, the sound ringing clean in the open air. It felt like something had healed then, something that had been broken so long I'd forgotten it could mend. But peace once again proved fragile. One afternoon, a rider came hard up the lane, dust thick behind him, horse lathered. It was Reese, the councilman. He swung down before I reached the porch. Jonas, he said, voice short of breath, we've got trouble. I didn't like the way he looked at Nora, standing behind me. What kind of trouble? Some folks say the sickness came from here, he said, from her. That's a lie, I said flat. Maybe so, he said, but lies travel faster than truth. They're holding a meeting tomorrow night. Talk of a vote. You should come. He mounted up and rode off before I could answer. The sound of his horse faded down the valley, leaving the silence heavy again. Nora's face was pale. They'll come, she said. Let 'em. You can't fight a town. I can fight for what's mine, I said, and you are. She looked at me then, tears shining but unshed. I don't want you to lose more for me. Then stay, I said, that's all you owe me. Stay. That night, neither of us slept. The wind picked up again, carrying the first chill of autumn. The boy dreamed, murmuring small sounds that seemed like words. She sat beside his cradle, eyes open, watching the fire die and start again. At dawn, I saddled the horse. I'll go to the meeting, I said. She touched my arm. Don't give them more hate to feed on. I'll give them the truth, I said. What they do with it is on them. I rode out as the sun lifted, the world painted in gray and gold. When I reached the church, the yard was full. Faces I'd known for years, turned cold by fear. I tied my horse and stepped inside. The talk stopped like a door slammed shut. The Reverend stood at the front, pale under the lamplight. Jonas, he said, you shouldn't have come alone. I didn't, I said. I brought the truth with me. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid. The truth is a hard thing to hand to a crowd that's already decided what it wants to hear. I stood there, the smell of dust and sweat thick in the air, and let them look at me. Men I'd ridden with, worked beside, women who'd brought casseroles when Margaret died. Every face I saw carried that same tight look, the one fear wears when it tries to pass for righteousness. Reverend Hall cleared his throat. We're not here to condemn, he began, only to protect the valley. Protect it from what? I asked. A fever that's already burned itself out? Or a woman who did more good than most of you'll ever manage? A ripple went through the crowd. Someone muttered, watch your mouth. I did watch it, and I used it anyway. You all remember that blizzard? The one that near buried us? You remember a sign nailed to my fence, need mother's milk. She came through that storm. None of you did. The Reverend lifted a hand trying to settle them. Jonas, no one doubts she meant well. Then why the meeting? Silence. The kind that makes you feel the weight of your own heartbeat. Mrs. Patterson spoke up from the back. Because decency's a fence that keeps us from turning wild, and she's blurred that line. First she lives in sin, then sickness follows. Maybe the Lord's making his point. I stepped toward her. You talk about fences. Maybe you've spent too long hiding behind yours. The murmur grew, ugly now. Reese tried to calm them, but the words had already slipped loose. The Reverend finally said, Jonas, no one wants harm, but fear's a hard horse to rein in. It would help if you and your wife showed faith, attended service, joined the community again. Faith doesn't live in a pew, I said. It lives in a woman who walks through a storm to feed another man's child. I turned then, walked out before the talk could twist further. Outside, the night air was cool, the sky a lid of stars. I felt the eyes on my back as I rode away. Some would call me proud, others a fool. Maybe both were true. When I reached the cabin, Nora was waiting on the porch, lantern light painting her face in golden shadow. You told them, she said. I told them what mattered. And They'll talk themselves tired, I said. Then they'll move on to the next ghost to chase. She nodded, though her shoulders sagged with the weight of it. Thank you. Don't, I said. It's not done yet. For days after, nothing happened. No riders, no letters, just work, the small rhythm of living. The air grew cooler, the grass brittle underfoot. The apple trees, though still young, held a scatter of pale fruit, small and stubborn, like they refused to die. One morning I found her beneath them, basket in hand, gathering what little the season had spared. The boy toddled beside her, unsteady but laughing. The sound of it caught me off guard. It was joy, pure and loud, cutting through months of hush. She looked up at me and smiled. First harvest, she said. They made it. So did we, I told her. But that night, she woke with a cough. Just a small one, dry and sharp, but enough to pull me from sleep. You all right? I asked. Just dust, she said. I wanted to believe her. For 2 days, she went on as before, though her color dimmed on the third morning. She nearly fainted at the stove. I caught her before she fell. You're burning, I said. The word's too familiar. It'll pass. But it didn't. The sickness had found her after all. I laid her down, mixed what remedies I knew, prayed without pride. The boy fussed, reaching for her, but she couldn't hold him. Her strength was gone to shadows. When fever dreams took her, she spoke of the barn fire that had taken her first child. He was crying, she whispered. I tried to get him, but the roof came down. I said, he's safe now, Nora. He's safe. Her eyes flickered open. Do you believe that? I do. She smiled faintly. Then don't waste your believing on me. Save it for him. The days blurred. She drifted between waking and sleep, her skin hot, breath shallow. I kept the boy close, singing old songs half forgotten. The orchard rustled outside, the sound of life trying to remind me it still existed. On the 4th night, her fever broke, but she was weaker than ever. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, feeling the bones beneath the skin. She whispered, if I don't wake, promise you'll tell him who I was. You'll wake, I said, promise anyway. I did. She closed her eyes, her hand still in mine. I don't know how long I sat there, the fire falling to embers, the boy breathing soft in his cradle. Dawn came slow, gray through the window. She stirred once, her lips moving. Jonas, she said, I'm here. Her eyes opened, clear for a moment. We built something, didn't we? We did. Then she smiled, a small tired thing, and drifted back into sleep, this time deep and clean. By evening, her fever was gone. The color returned to her cheeks, faint but true. When she woke, she reached for the boy and held him long, the way a person holds proof of mercy. I watched her, too tired to speak, too full to pray. Outside, the apples hung heavy now, the trees bending under their own weight. When the wind came, a few dropped to the ground, thudding soft into the dirt. She looked up at the sound. They're ready, she said. So are we, I told her. That night, after the boy slept, we sat on the porch. The moon was near full, washing the fields in silver. She leaned against my shoulder, light as a breath. You think they'll ever forget what we've been? She asked. No, I said, but maybe they'll remember what we became. She nodded, eyes on the orchard. That's enough. It was. For the first time in years, the wind passed through the valley without teeth. Winter returned softer that year, as if even the weather had grown weary of fighting. Frost clung to the edges of the windows, but it didn't creep inside like before. The cabin had warmth now, the kind that doesn't come from firewood. The boy was walking, a little drunk on his own legs, and Nora would laugh every time he tumbled into her skirt. That laugh could hush any ghost. We lived quiet. The town kept its distance, half from guilt, half from habit. Folks still watched when we went in for supplies, but the stares lost their edge. The sickness had moved on, the gossip with it. What was left was the rhythm of days, feeding stock, mending fences, patching what the wind tore down. One morning, I found Nora standing by the apple trees, arms folded, her breath turning to steam. The fruit was long gone, but the branches held tight buds, already thinking of spring. "They'll bloom early," she said. "Reckon they learned from you," I told her. She smiled but didn't look at me. "I never thought I'd live through another winter," she said. "You have," I said, "and you will." She turned then, her eyes bright with something I hadn't seen before. Hope, maybe, or the first hint of peace. "You believe that?" "I do." She reached out and took my hand, fingers cold but sure. "Then maybe I will too." That night, as we sat by the fire, she said, "I never thanked you proper." "For what?" "For not letting me die twice." "You would have done the same." "Maybe," she said, "but you did it." There wasn't anything more to say after that. We just sat, the fire talking for us, the boy asleep between us, breathing easy. Days shortened. Snow came and went, the kind that dusted the world without meaning harm. Sometimes she'd hum that old tune again, the one without words. I'd listen, eyes closed, and think maybe that's what grace sounded like, something that had no need of language. One afternoon in late February, I was out splitting wood when she called me from the porch. Her voice carried strange, half joy, half fear. "Jonas," she said. I dropped the axe and went to her. She was pale, one hand pressed to her belly. I knew that look before she said it. "You sure?" I asked. She nodded, tears cutting clean down her face. "I'm sure." I took her hands. For a long while neither of us spoke. Then I said, "We'll make room." She laughed, shaky but real. "We barely fit as it is. We'll find a way. We always do." The months that followed felt different, lighter somehow. She moved slower, and I took on more of the work, but she wouldn't stop doing what she could. "I'm not glass," she'd say, brushing me off when I tried to help. Still, I caught her resting her hand on her belly when she thought I wasn't looking. The boy, Samuel, though everyone called him Little Sam, started talking in broken words, mostly Ma and Pa. Every time he said Ma, Nora would freeze as if the sound both healed and hurt. She told me once, "I thought I'd never hear that again." "You will for the rest of your life," I said. She smiled. "That's what scares me." By late spring, the apple trees were heavy with bloom again. The air smelled sweet enough to make a man dizzy. Nora would walk among them every evening, her dress brushing the grass, her hair loose around her shoulders. Sometimes she'd stop and rest her hand on a trunk, whisper something I couldn't catch. Maybe names, maybe prayers. One night she said, "If it's a boy, I want to name him James. If it's a girl, Margaret." "Both good names," I said. "Both ghosts," she said softly. I looked at her, the moonlight turning her face pale and bright all at once. "Then maybe it's time ghosts had peace too." She nodded, eyes wet but calm. "Maybe it is." The days grew longer, full of small, ordinary grace. The creek ran high, The grass thickened, the animals fattened. The valley breathed easier, as if it, too, had survived something. One morning, she didn't come out to the porch. I found her inside, sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing shallow. "It's time," she said, and I felt the old fear climb my spine. I boiled water, tore cloth, did every useless thing a man does when the world narrows to the sound of a woman's pain. The hours dragged, long and brutal. She gripped my hand until her knuckles went white, but she never cried out, not once. When it was done, the room filled with a sound I hadn't heard since that night long ago. A baby's cry, thin and perfect. Nora laughed through her tears. "James," she said, "James Thomas." I held him, tiny and red-faced, his fists already fighting the air. "He's got your strength," I told her. She smiled weakly. "Then he'll outlive us both." For days after, the house felt different. The air was thick with new life, the kind that made you whisper without knowing why. Nora healed slow, but her eyes had light again. Little Sam would peek into the cradle, whispering nonsense to his brother. I'd stand at the door and just listen, the sound of two children filling a space that had once held only silence. The first week of June, the apple blossoms began to fall, white and soft as snow. Nora sat beneath the trees, the baby in her arms, petals landing on them both. "You ever think," she said, "that maybe the wind wasn't trying to hurt us all along?" "Maybe it was just trying to make us listen," I said. She smiled. "Then I'm listening now." And I believed her. That night, as the wind moved through the orchard, it carried the scent of apple and earth, clean and forgiving. The world had finally learned to be gentle, and so had we. The summer after James was born was the kind the valley still talks about. Warm days, cool nights, the grass high enough to hide a child. The apple trees filled out with leaves so thick they whispered secrets in the dark. We'd sit under them most evenings, watching little Sam chase fireflies while Nora nursed the baby. Sometimes I'd think back to the man I'd been before her. Raw, empty, a wound that never closed, and I couldn't recognize him anymore. The town kept its distance, though the tension had thinned. Every so often, someone would ride by and tip a hat, pretending to be neighborly again. We'd nod back. That was enough. Out here, forgiveness isn't words. It's the choice to leave a man alone. Life found its rhythm. I worked the stock, built a new fence line, added a small shed. Nora tended the garden and taught little Sam how to name the colors of the sky at dusk. She'd laugh when he mixed them up, calling the sunset apple gold. Sometimes, in the quiet between chores, I'd catch her staring at the horizon like it held a promise she hadn't decided whether to trust. One evening in late August, we sat on the porch as the day folded into night. The boys were asleep, their soft breaths blending with the hum of crickets. The sky was awash of purple and smoke. Nora said, "Do you ever wonder what comes next?" I said, "This." "This?" "Right here, Ma." I said, "You, me, them. That's enough for what's left of a lifetime." She smiled, but it carried a trace of sadness. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't, but it's simple." She leaned back, closed her eyes. Simple's a kind of miracle. That night, when she slept, I watched her breathing, slow and even, and thought how life had turned quiet without turning dull. Quiet like a prayer, not like grief. The next day brought thunder. It rolled down the valley in deep echoes, and before noon, rain fell hard and heavy. I was out mending a gate when I saw Nora running from the orchard, skirts soaked, her face pale. "Jonas," she called, "the creek's rising fast." We hurried to the edge of the property, the boys safe in the cabin. The water had swollen, foaming white around the rocks. "It'll hold," I said, though I wasn't sure. By evening, the storm broke. The rain stopped, leaving the air thick with the smell of wet earth. The creek had carved new lines through the pasture, but the house stood untouched. Nora laughed when she saw me dripping wet on the porch. "I told you to come in before it got bad." "You did," I said, "but I had to see what the world was trying to wash away." She wrung out her hair and said, "Maybe it wasn't trying to wash anything away. Maybe it was cleaning what stayed." It was a simple line, but it stuck with me. After everything, the storms, the whispers, the sickness, maybe what was left wasn't what we lost, but what had endured. Autumn came gentle. The orchard turned gold. Little Sam grew taller, his hair sun-bleached and wild. He'd help me gather firewood, always carrying more pride than kindling. Nora would watch us from the doorway, baby James on her hip, her face soft with something that looked like contentment. One Sunday morning, the Reverend himself rode up the trail. I hadn't seen him since the meeting. He dismounted slow, his face lined deeper than before. "Jonas," he said, tipping his hat, "mind if I sit?" I nodded, poured coffee. He took a sip and looked out toward the orchard. "Fine trees," he said. "They've worked for it," I said. He nodded. "Heard tell your boys walking." "Both of them," I said. He smiled faintly. "Children have a way of teaching us grace." "I suppose they do." He was quiet a long while before saying, "People talk less now. Maybe they finally learned the difference between sin and survival." I met his eyes. "Took them long enough." He set down the cup, rose, and said, "The Lord sees hearts, Jonas. I reckon he's pleased with what he sees here." When he left, Nora came to the door. "What did he want?" "Nothing," I said. "Just to look at what Mercy built." She smiled, then let him look. The day shortened. We harvested the apples, sweet and crisp, enough to fill barrels. Nora baked pies, their scent spilling from the windows. The house smelled like home in a way I'd never known before. One evening, after the boys were asleep, we sat under the trees. The moon was high, full and clean. Nora leaned her head on my shoulder. "You ever think we were meant to find each other?" she asked. "I think we were meant to survive each other," I said. She laughed quietly. "That's close enough to love." "It is love," I said. She looked up at me, eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Then say it plain." "I love you, Nora." She didn't answer right away. Then she reached up, touched my face, and said, "You took long enough." I kissed her then, slow and sure, and for the first time since that winter long ago, there was no echo of loss in it, only life, full and warm. The wind moved through the orchard soft and low, carrying the scent of apples and the sound of the trees breathing. I realized then that some things, once broken, don't stay shattered. They grow back different, maybe stronger. When we went inside, the fire was still burning. Nora set another log on it and whispered, "We've come a long way from that storm." "We have, Fi," I said, "and we'll keep going." The next morning, the first frost silvered the grass, and the world began its slow turn toward another winter. But I wasn't afraid. The wind no longer carried the sound of loneliness. It carried the sound of home. Years have a way of slipping by when you're no longer waiting for them to hurt. The winters came and went, softer each time. The apple trees grew thick and gnarled, strong enough for little Sam to climb. He'd perch up there with his brother, tossing half-ripe apples down at me while I worked the fence. Their laughter rolled across the pasture, and every time I heard it, I felt the world make sense again. Nora changed in ways only I could see. Her hair turned a deeper shade of gold in summer, the lines at her eyes more from smiling than strain. She carried a calm that made even silence feel warm. Sometimes I'd wake in the gray light before dawn and just watch her breathe. There was stillness in her, the kind of man spends a lifetime chasing. The valley learned to speak our names kindly again. Folks would wave when we came to town. Mrs. Patterson even brought a pie one spring, left it on the porch without knocking. I told Nora we ought to thank her. She said, "We just did, and we left it at that." Life grew full of small things that mattered. The smell of bread cooling on the table, the sound of boots by the door, the creak of the rocker where she sat with James, now a sturdy little thing with his mother's eyes. The rhythm of it all became a kind of hymn, no choir needed, no preacher calling us to remember. We were living our remembering. On the 5th year after that winter, the orchard bloomed, heavier than ever. Nora said it was a good sign. She hung a ribbon on each tree, 4 colors, one for Margaret, one for Thomas, one for herself, and one for me. And she tied them slow, whispering the names under her breath, and when the wind caught them, they fluttered like prayers set free. That night, we sat beneath the trees, the boys chasing fireflies between the roots. The moon hung low, wide and gold. "You ever think about that first night?" she asked all the time. I said, "It's where everything began." She smiled. "You mean where everything almost ended?" "Maybe both." The chair creaked softly as she leaned back. "If I hadn't heard him cry, if I hadn't written that sign." She reached over, took my hand. Then we'd have both gone on dying in our own ways. I looked at her, the years between then and now sitting gentle on her face. "You ever wonder why the wind stopped having teeth?" I asked. She shook her head. "Maybe it was never the wind that changed." The orchard moved with the breeze, branches brushing one another in slow applause. For a long while we just listened. To the leaves, to the quiet breathing of our sons, to the heartbeat of the land that had nearly broken us both. When the boys were grown, they built their own cabins along the ridge. They married, had children, planted new trees. The valley filled with our name. Every spring, the blossoms came, and each year when they fell, they looked like snow, but the kind that doesn't freeze you anymore. Now when I walk the orchard alone, I still hear her voice somewhere between the wind and the earth. Nora's been gone some years, buried beneath the oldest tree, the one she named for herself. I visit at dawn, the air cool and wet, and tell her the same thing I told her that night long ago. We made it. Sometimes when the sun climbs the ridge, I swear I see her shadow move through the branches, skirts brushing the blossoms, hands touching each trunk like she's still making sure they stand. The world has softened around me. The wind still speaks, but it hums now instead of howls. I reckon mercy doesn't come all at once. It arrives quiet, settles in, takes its time. The apples ripen early these days. Their scent fills the air, sweet and steady. I pick one, turn it in my hand, and think of everything that grew from one storm, one cry, one act of kindness. I bite into it, crisp, tart, full of sun, And for a moment, I'm back in that cabin, the fire low, her hand steady, the baby's cry turning into peace. Funny thing about mercy, it doesn't always save you right away. Sometimes it just waits, patient as the earth, until you're ready to believe you deserve it. And when the wind passes through the orchard now, it carries no teeth, no sorrow, only her laughter, soft and low, mixing with the rustle of the trees we planted together. That's how the story ends. Not with thunder, not with loss, but with a man standing among apple blossoms, listening to the world he once feared, finally speak back in kindness. We lived, not just survived, and that's enough.